At dawn on April 14, 1945, the mist hung low over a makeshift prisoner of war camp near the village of Remagen, Germany. The ruins of the bridge across the Rhine still smoked faintly in the distance. Steel girders twisted like broken bones, reminders of the desperate struggle only weeks before. German prisoners, men who had fought with determination in the Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS, stood behind barbed wire, cold, hungry, and wary. The ground was still damp from the night rain. Boots squelched in the mud. The guards, American GIs, paced the perimeter with M1 Garand slung casually over their shoulders. But instead of hostility, a strange sound carried across the camp, the thud of a ball hitting leather. A bat cracking against wood, the unmistakable rhythm of a game. U.S. Army Camp Report, April 1945. The Germans leaned closer to the wire, puzzled. Baseball? Here, in the middle of a continent scarred by artillery and firebombs. Some thought it a trick, others a cruel joke. They expected the Americans to gloat, to mock, to reinforce their humiliation. Instead, one private stepped forward with a smile, holding up a spare glove, gesturing toward the prisoners. Slowly, almost unbelievably, the Americans invited their former enemies to join the game. The scene stunned the Germans. This was not the brutal enemy their propaganda had described. It was something else entirely, a display of humanity in the ashes of total war. Bundesarchiv POW diary entry, April 1945. To understand the shock in their eyes, one must first recall the world these men had inhabited only weeks earlier. The Reich still clung to its ideology of total resistance, urging men to fight to the death. Hitler's speeches had promised that capture meant dishonor, that the Americans were ruthless. Yet by 1945, reality had broken the illusions. Millions of Germans were surrendering. By war's end, the United States would hold 371,000 prisoners in Europe, with another 425,000 shipped to camps in America itself. U.S. Army Statistical Division, 1946. These camps were not the death pits of the Eastern Front, where Soviet captives were starved and frozen. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was, to a surprising extent, honored by the United States. Prisoners received rations, clothing, shelter. They were even allowed letters home. But what unsettled the Germans most was the cultural gulf, the casual way Americans carried themselves. To the GIs, baseball was as natural as breathing. To the Germans, it was alien, strange, yet oddly magnetic. Geneva Convention Compliance Report, 1945. That spring, the Americans were not merely fighting battles. They were living symbols of a different kind of society. Their divisions had fought with steel and fire at Normandy, at the Bulge and across the Rhine. Yet behind the lines, in the camps, they revealed a startling contrast. Discipline paired with generosity, military might softened by games of sport. It was a form of psychological warfare the Germans could never have anticipated. Dramatized composite. The setting at Remagen made the moment even more extraordinary. Just a month earlier, the Germans had fought desperately to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge, hoping to halt the American push eastward. Explosives had failed, engineers had died in frantic efforts to bring it down, and still the U.S. Army had poured across. Thousands of prisoners had been taken in the chaotic fighting. Now those same men stood in the camp, staring at the unbelievable sight of their captors, tossing balls in the air, laughing, spitting dust, and shouting across makeshift diamond lines marked with sticks. U.S. Army After Action Report, March 1945. Numbers give weight to the scene. In April 1945, the U.S. Army had constructed dozens of temporary POW enclosures, known as Rheinwiesenlager, Rhine Meadow Camps. At their peak, they held up to 1.7 million captured Germans in vast open fields. Food was scarce, conditions were harsh, and mortality was real. Yet even there, amid overcrowding and misery, moments like this occurred. American guards, many of them barely older than the prisoners, sought normalcy through their own culture. Baseball was their anchor. U.S. POW Administration Report, 1946. For the prisoners, it was bewildering. German military culture was rigid, obsessed with hierarchy, order, and relentless discipline. Sports had been tied to ideology. Gymnastics, athletics, things that hardened the body for war. Baseball, by contrast, seemed chaotic yet ordered, competitive yet playful. To be invited into such a game felt like stepping onto another planet. Some resisted, too proud or too suspicious. But others, exhausted by years of war, accepted the gloves, learning the strange motions of swinging a bat, chasing a ball, running bases marked in the mud. Bundesarchiv POW Memoir 1947. For the Americans, there was also symbolism in the act. Baseball was democracy in motion. Every man took his turn at bat. Every man had a place on the field. The sport blurred ranks and backgrounds. Officers and enlisted might sit side by side in the bleachers shouting for their team. For prisoners accustomed to a system that worshipped authority and demanded obedience, it was staggering. U.S. War Department Morale Report 1945. This single game did not erase hatred or undo the carnage of the war. The men playing had lost comrades in the Ardennes, in Hurtgen Forest, in Normandy hedgerows. Many carried wounds, visible and invisible. The prisoners themselves had fought ferociously, some complicit in the atrocities that had defined the German war effort. Yet in that muddy field, for a few hours, the war seemed suspended. There were no artillery barrages, no MG-42s rattling death, only the arc of a baseball, the laughter of men, the shared rhythm of running and catching. Prisoner testimony, U.S. Military Archives, 1946. Still, the deeper shock remained. Why would an enemy extend such gestures? The Germans whispered among themselves, some convinced it was propaganda, others struck with a gnawing realization. Perhaps this was the true strength of America, not just tanks and bombers, but the ability to humanize even those who had tried to kill them. One prisoner later wrote that the memory of that baseball game haunted him longer than the battles, because it revealed how hollow the Nazi vision had been. Bundesarchiv POW Diary 1948. By nightfall, the prisoners returned to their wire enclosures, still murmuring about what they had seen. For many, it was their first direct contact with a different kind of world, one where mercy coexisted with victory, and culture carried as much weight as weapons. The Americans rolled up their gloves, stacked their bats, and returned to guard duty. But a seed had been planted, one that would grow in unexpected ways in the months and years to come. Because in that moment, the game of baseball was not just a pastime. It was a message, a signal carried not by radio but by leather and wood. This is who we are. And for the German prisoners, it was more disarming than any artillery barrage. Yet beneath the surface, questions lingered. Was this kindness consistent or a fleeting anomaly? Would the same prisoners, sent across the ocean to faraway camps in Texas or Iowa, find the same humanity or something harsher? Could a sport truly bridge the gulf carved by years of destruction? The answers would emerge only in the deeper story of America's prisoner of war program, its hidden logistics, and the cultural shockwaves it produced on both sides of the Atlantic. And it begins with one simple, unforgettable question. Whispered by a stunned German soldier to his comrade behind the wire, "Why are they inviting us to play?" The secret was not simply in the baseball game itself, but in what it represented. Behind the spectacle of GIs tossing a ball to their prisoners lay a hidden advantage that shaped the entire American approach to the war. A culture of logistics, morale and organization that was utterly alien to the Germans. To the Reich, war was total, merciless, consuming. To the Americans, war was something fought not only with rifles and tanks, but also with factories, food, and even games. U.S. War Department Morale Division Report 1945. At the heart of the American system was an astonishing ability to sustain not just armies, but entire communities abroad. Baseball was part of that machinery. In 1943 alone, the U.S. War Department ordered more than 15,000 baseball bats, 25,000 gloves, and tens of thousands of balls to be shipped overseas for troop morale. Quartermaster General Supply Report, 1943. These were not luxuries, they were considered essential equipment alongside boots and rations. For the Germans who grew up under the iron discipline of Prussian drill and Hitler Youth ideology, this was incomprehensible. An army that could afford to fight and play must have resources beyond measure. Dramatized composite. Technically, the U.S. Army's prisoner of war program was one of the most sophisticated of the war. By 1945, American engineers had designed entire transit systems to move prisoners from Europe to the United States. Liberty ships, mass-produced at shipyards like Kaiser's Richmond facility, carried not just tanks and ammunition, but thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic. Each Liberty ship could hold 9,000 tons of cargo and transport, up to 550 men. Maritime Commission Construction Report, 1944. To the German soldiers who once believed America was soft and decadent, the sight of this colossal logistical machine was shattering. Within the United States, the POW camps themselves became marvels of quiet efficiency. Over 700 camps were scattered across 46 states, some housing as many as 8,000 prisoners. They were run like clockwork, guarded perimeters, scheduled rations, and even work programs where prisoners labored in agriculture or forestry. Farmers in Texas, Nebraska, and Georgia received assistance from German POW labor when American manpower was drained by the draft. U.S. Department of Agriculture Report 1945. Every element was engineered for both practicality and compliance with Geneva standards. It was not kindness alone, it was system. The Germans could hardly believe it. At Camp Swift, Texas, a diary entry by one POW captured the disbelief. We expected starvation and chains. Instead, we are given bread, meat, and even taught a strange game with bats. It is not war. It is another world. Bundesarchiv, POW Diary, 1945. But this cultural and logistical advantage was not confined to the homeland. In the field, too, Americans used their hidden assets to disarm their enemies in ways that transcended firepower. Radios, trucks, portable kitchens, even refrigeration, these became weapons of morale. A German company might march for days on black bread and horse meat. An American infantry unit rolled forward with hot coffee, canned beef, and the knowledge that baseball games and USO shows waited just beyond the line. U.S. Army Quartermaster Report 1944. The shock crystallized most dramatically in one battle, the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in March 1945. The Germans had wired the massive steel structure with demolition charges, determined to deny the Americans a crossing of the Rhine. Yet when U.S. forces of the 9th Armored Division stormed the bridge on March 7th, the explosives failed. In a desperate firefight, engineers under Lieutenant Karl Timmerman held the span until reinforcements poured across. U.S. Army After Action Report, March 1945. For the Germans, this was catastrophic. Their doctrine held that the Rhine was the Reich's last natural barrier. Without it, the heartland lay open. But beyond the bridge's physical capture, what unsettled them more was the speed with which the Americans turned the victory into permanence. Within 24 hours, U.S. Army engineers, many trained in stateside factories and construction yards, had stabilized the battered bridge with timber and steel. Within days, pontoon bridges stretched across the river, enabling entire divisions to cross. Army Corps of Engineers Report 1945. And as German prisoners were rounded up near Remagen, they witnessed something unthinkable. The same soldiers who had stormed through fire now paused to play baseball beside the ruined bridge. It was not carelessness. It was a statement of abundance, of confidence. The Americans could afford to fight like lions and then relax like citizens. For the exhausted Wehrmacht infantrymen, who had been told that their enemies were brutal savages, it was destabilizing. Bundesarchiv, Remagen POW Memoir, 1947. Consider the technical contrast. German infantry carried the Karabiner 98K, bolt-action rifles with a 5-round capacity. Reliable but slow. American GIs wielded the semi-automatic M1 Garand, firing 8 rounds with speed and precision. Technical Manual TM 9-1275, 1943. German panzer divisions relied on dwindling supplies of gasoline, often resorting to horse-drawn carts. Some American armored divisions rode in M4 Shermans churned out of Detroit Arsenal, 49,234 of them by war's end, each supplied with spare parts, fuel, and replacement crews. U.S. Ordnance Production Report 1945. And above all, the Americans carried a morale weapon the Germans did not understand. In their downtime they played. Baseball in Normandy orchards, football in Italian fields, boxing rings set up in North Africa. Even in the shadow of the Rhine, they carried gloves and bats alongside rifles and grenades. The equipment was mass-produced by companies like Hillerick and Bradsby, makers of the Louisville Slugger, repurposed for war morale contracts. War Production Board Records 1943. For the German prisoners it was surreal. One dramatized composite report describes a soldier muttering, "They fight like machines but laugh like children. How can such an enemy be defeated?" The cultural dissonance gnawed at them, breaking down the propaganda that had sustained their will to fight. Even American officers recognized the strategic power of this cultural edge. Colonel Russell L. Blaisdell, in a morale report, wrote, "Recreation is not diversion, it is discipline by another name." It reminds the soldier what he fights for. U.S. Army Morale Division Report, 1945. The baseball game at Remagen was no accident. It was an extension of the same philosophy that kept American soldiers supplied, fed and mentally resilient across 2 oceans of war. And so, in that muddy enclosure by the Rhine, German prisoners confronted something they could not counter with Panzerfausts or MG-42s. They had been defeated not only by overwhelming numbers and firepower, but by a system that treated culture itself as a weapon. Baseball was the most visible symbol, but behind it stood a vast arsenal of industry, morale, and organizational genius. The game ended, but the memory lingered. The Germans were left to ponder how an enemy so efficient in battle could also be so casual in peace. And in their stunned silence, a realization began to take root. The war was lost not only on the battlefield, but in the realm of spirit and society. Still, questions remained. What lasting impact would these games, these small acts of humanity, have on the psyche of the defeated? Could sport soften surrender, or would it deepen humiliation? And in the broader strategy of the war, did this cultural edge truly matter, or was it a fleeting footnote in a conflict of steel and fire? The answer would emerge in the final months, when baseball bred, and a strange sense of mercy reshaped the very way Germans remembered their captors. In the weeks that followed the surrender of entire German armies, the memory of baseball games inside POW camps did not fade. For the prisoners, it became an emblem of something deeper, a glimpse into the culture of their captors, a force as disorienting as the Shermans and Mustangs that had shattered their divisions. These small, seemingly trivial acts rippled through the minds of men who had once believed America was weak, decadent, and doomed to collapse in the face of German discipline. Instead, they found themselves standing in fields of mud, sharing leather gloves and wooden bats with the very soldiers who had defeated them. Bundesarchiv POW Memoir, 1946. Strategically, the United States prisoner of war program had immense consequences. Nearly 425,000 German soldiers were shipped to America, scattered across hundreds of camps in Texas, Iowa, Georgia, and beyond. Another 371,000 were housed in Europe. U.S. War Department Statistical Review, 1946. The U.S. Army did not simply detain these men. It fed them, clothed them, and, crucially, exposed them to American culture. Baseball games, movies, literacy classes, and even vocational training turned the camps into laboratories of democracy. For German prisoners indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda, the experience was destabilizing, sometimes even transformative. Reports from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey in 1946 documented interviews with former POWs who confessed that the experience of captivity reshaped their perception of America more than the battlefield ever had. One noted, "We had been told the Americans were brutal, yet they gave us food and even games. I realized our leaders had lied to us." U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The psychological effect extended beyond individual prisoners. Letters home, often heavily censored, still carried hints of surprise. Families back in Germany learned that their sons were not only alive, but playing baseball in Texas or Nebraska. The shock eroded the Nazi narrative of barbaric American cruelty. Slowly, the myth of American weakness was replaced by awe at its abundance. Dramatized composite engineers and technicians also played a hidden role in sustaining this morale weapon. Companies like Spaulding and Louisville Slugger, under War Production Board contracts, ensured that bats, gloves, and balls were available to troops overseas and to camps at home. War Production Board records, 1944. Civilian workers in Detroit, Chicago, and Louisville mass-produced not just tanks and bombers, but the cultural tools that reminded soldiers and prisoners of what America represented. This quiet contribution is often overlooked. Yet without it, the image of baseball as a bridge between enemies would never have existed. In a larger sense, the baseball games symbolize something that permeated U.S. strategy: the fusion of overwhelming material power with psychological warfare. By 1944, the United States was producing 96,000 aircraft annually, 57,000 tanks, and millions of tons of munitions. U.S. war production statistics 1945. But alongside this torrent of steel came morale packages, Red Cross deliveries, and cultural exports. The German soldier encountered not just the thunder of B-17s overhead, but also the bewildering sight of American guards laughing as they played a sport for no reason other than joy. Axis commanders noticed the psychological toll. In interrogations after the war, German officers admitted that their men were unsettled by the casual confidence of American soldiers. One officer described his shock upon seeing prisoners write home about playing ball with their captors. It is as though the Americans are at war and at peace simultaneously. They fight without hate. That is their strength. U.S. Army Interrogation Report 1946. The long-term impact reached far beyond 1945. Many German POWs returned home with stories of fairness, discipline, and strange American customs like baseball, jukeboxes, and chewing gum. In devastated towns and villages, these stories planted seeds. When West Germany began rebuilding, such memories influenced perceptions of the occupying power. American culture, once dismissed as crude, became a source of fascination. In the 1950s, baseball leagues even briefly emerged in occupied Germany, organized by former POWs who had learned the game in captivity. U.S. Army Europe Recreation Report, 1952. For veterans and families in the United States, the legacy was different, but no less profound. Photographs of GIs teaching German prisoners to swing bats circulated in local newspapers, framed as proof that America fought with justice and humanity. To mothers and fathers who had sent sons overseas, the images reassured them that their boys had not been brutalized by the experience of war, that even in victory they had retained their decency. U.S. Homefront News Archives, 1945. And yet, the cost of such humanity was never forgotten. Behind the smiles and games, the war's brutality remained. By the time the last German surrendered, Europe was in ruins. 70 million people were dead worldwide, and millions of civilians had been displaced. Baseball could not erase the horrors of concentration camps, the firestorms over Dresden, or the frozen corpses at Stalingrad. What it did offer was a fleeting reminder that civilization could survive amid barbarity. U.S. Army Historical Division Report, 1947. In strategic terms, this balance of power and mercy defined America's emergence as a global superpower. Unlike Nazi Germany, which fought to annihilate, or Imperial Japan, which fought to dominate, the United States demonstrated an ability to crush enemies militarily while integrating them afterward. Baseball in POW camps was a small but powerful symbol of this philosophy. A nation confident enough to win without dehumanizing. The lesson endured into the Cold War. When American forces later occupied Korea, deployed to Vietnam, or stationed in Germany for decades, they brought their culture with them. Football, baseball, jazz, and later rock music became as much a part of U.S. military presence as rifles and armored vehicles. In the Gulf War of 1991, soldiers carried portable satellite TVs and video games into the desert, an echo of the bats and gloves of 1945. Defense Morale and Welfare Report, 1992. The principle was the same. Morale and culture were weapons as essential as firepower. For the Germans who had once stared through barbed wire at Americans tossing a baseball, the memory became almost unbearable. Some spoke of humiliation, being reduced to spectators of their enemies' strange games. Others described gratitude, relief, even admiration. One dramatized composite prisoner summed it up years later. They defeated us with steel, but they conquered us with their laughter. The story of baseball in POW camps reveals a profound truth about modern war. Victory is not only measured in bridges seized or tanks destroyed. It is measured in the ability to project humanity as power, to turn culture into a weapon that disarms more effectively than bullets. For America in 1945, baseball was both pastime and propaganda, morale booster and message. As the war closed, a German prisoner in Texas scrawled a final entry into his diary. "Today they let me pitch. I threw badly and they laughed, but not cruelly. I thought of my village, of my father, and of the ruins of my country. For a moment I forgot the war. Perhaps that is their secret, that they can make you forget." Bundesarchiv, POW Diary 1946, and so in the end, The game of baseball played behind the wire of prisoner camps carried weight far beyond its innings. It shaped perceptions, softened hearts, and foreshadowed the post-war world where enemies would become allies. In the words of one American guard, remembered decades later, "We didn't just win with guns. We won because we showed them who we really were." Dramatized composite. In modern war, connection can outweigh firepower, and humanity can break stronger than